The great and famous gods and goddesses of Rome existed in full view in the register of state, spectacle, and the ceremonials of the festival calendar with all its pomp and ceremony. They had public temples and public priests and priestesses to attend them. Some of them loomed large, not just ideologically, but literally, because their temples on the Capitoline Hill, where we've lingered for the past several episodes, were elevated above the city and were most conspicuous in their holy sight and grandeur. But now we descend from those sacred heights and those superlative deities, and we take to the streets of Rome. Down in those dusty streets, bustling with all the raucous affairs of daily life, we're surrounded by people from all walks of life, thriving or surviving as best they can. Merchants and hawkers, senators and slaves, fortune-tellers and farmers, soldiers, sailors, seamstresses, and all the myriad people milling about the capital, preoccupied with whatever it is that has them out in the crowds. The gods were not removed from this hustle and bustle of everyday life. They were not serene and separate, but here and ever present, in every nook and cranny, physically in the streets with their shrines and temples crowded in amongst the markets and tenement blocks as part of the everyday landscape. And they were here too in their numinous ways, unseen but busy in their multifarious activities, protecting, overseeing, guiding, meddling, and punishing. Despite focus usually falling on those famous Olympians like Jupiter, Juno, Mercury, Mars, and so on, you probably know that Roman religion had a god for just about everything. And you probably know that people were very superstitious about them and went to lengths to make sure they were properly respected and attended. Somehow the internet is still awash with people holding Victorian opinions about how derivative Roman religion was, how it was all just a lackluster reproduction of Greek religion. And what is recognized as native to Rome is, moreover, often described as procedural and state-sanctioned, lacking any real emotion or spirit. I'm quite sure you've heard people say that it's because of the emptiness of such a spiritually unsatisfying religious practice that Christianity managed to replace the old religion. You've probably even heard people arguing about whether or not Romans really believed in their gods at all. And that's a very old-fashioned point of view that comes again from those old whiskered Christian colonial scholars who couldn't reconcile the great Roman statesmen and thinkers they admired with a genuine belief in gods they found ridiculous. They wanted to absolve their heroes of what they deemed silly religiosity and the religion they scorned as pagan. Which is why we're here, in this series, and now down here in the streets of Rome, to seek out those old gods and to give them back their names. We want to get a sense of how this divine multitude coexisted with the more famous ones we always hear about, how they guided the rhythms of everyday life, how they characterized the streets and the boundaries and the byways of living, and most of all we want to understand how they affected individuals and their private and personal lives, because those individuals were the real people for whom these gods were real and important. And collectively, these individuals made an empire. So having considered the view from the top, with Jupiter and those mighty but obscure gods who challenged him, we turn from the monumental to the miniature, from public to private, and from what was happening in the great temples to what was happening even in the humblest of homes. To get a sense of how the very landscape and fabric of daily life was permeated with the divine presence, in this episode we turn to the most abundant, but also the most personal and private and even secretive divinities of house, home, place, and space. Let us enter the realm of the Lares. The Lares were everywhere. The Roman belief was that every place had its spirits and guardians. They weren't a collective making a joint effort to preside over everything. They were very particular to the place and the people where they presided. Some places, like a clearing in the forest, a wooded grove, or a fountain, had an atmosphere that felt like something special, something divine inhabited the place. But absolutely every place had its own collection of spirits. We're lucky to have the words of a prayer to some Lares preserved in some of the earliest surviving works of Latin prose. Cato the Elder, a staunch Roman general and politician from the 2nd century BCE, records the procedure and even the words to be said if you happened to be out on the land and about to engage in some pruning. He instructs that a pig needs to be offered in atonement, and the imminent pruner should recite these words. Be you God or be you goddess to whom this place is sacred, as it is right to offer for atonement to you a pig for the pruning of this sacred place, on account of these, and on account of these things, whether I or whether one ordered by me offered it, in order that it may have been done rightly. For the sake of this thing I pray good prayers to you for the sacrificing of this pig for atonement, that you may be favourable and gracious to me, my family and house, and to my children. For the sake of these things be honoured by the sacrificing of the pig for atonement. It's quite amazing to hear the words of a Roman prayer because it really gives us a sense of the content and the tone of how the spirits of a place were placated. You'll notice the identity of the divinity addressed isn't even known to the person praying and pruning. It may be a god, maybe a goddess. The point is that it's just a given that there must be a divinity inhabiting the place. And if you have your shears out and are about to do it violence, you need to make sure that no retribution follows. It's interesting to see the prayer extends that protection out to the family and household too. The poor pig is a valuable offering to ensure that the deal is a good one and will be accepted. The divinities addressed here are thought to be the Lares Rurales, the ancient guardians of the fields, but just as every tree was also believed to have its own guardian resident within it, every other place also had its Lares and Genius Loci, the spirit of the place. Most importantly, this included every home. Every family and every house had its own special Lares, the Lares Familiares, and its own spirit of the place. These weren't generic, but very specific to the individual family and home where they lived. Unlike some of the other deities that we've discussed so far, these aren't exactly forgotten because the film Gladiator made them famous with Maximus, if you remember, who lost his home and family and reverentially carried around with him these little bronze figurines of his family gods, consulting with them and praying to them, and these were the Lares. So to some extent, they've entered the popular consciousness, but think about what it means in terms of personal religion and your levels of emotional investment. If these were gods whose only concerns were of you and your family specifically. Moreover, imagine which gods would preoccupy your devotions as you went about your business. You might visit Jupiter in his temple or sacrifice to Mata Matuta on her festival day, but these are gods that inhabit your very house and your house alone, and they stay there. Maximus took the images of his Lares with him, but that's because he was displaced. They weren't supposed to be portable. They were gods that lived with you, quite literally. You poured little libations of wine to them when you drank, you left them little bits of food, and any food that fell on the floor was automatically theirs. You brought their little statuettes to the table at banquets. But otherwise, they inhabited the Lararium. This was the little shrine in every house that was dedicated to them. In impoverished homes, these were just basic, just a little shelf or alcove where lamps could be lit and little offerings could be made, but sometimes they were quite ornate. And if you've ever been, or if you ever go to Pompeii or Herculaneum, you'll see them on those eerily preserved streets and in the various homes. The shrines to the gods of those long-vanished families still pop with lively colour. And something of the vivacious spirit of these gods still emanates from these long, empty shrines. The iconography isn't fixed, but there are some standard features. The Lares themselves tend to be depicted in pairs, although a singular lar is also possible. And they always look festive and full of energy. Usually they're dancing and they hold drinking cups called rhytons, which would have been full of wine. So the general sense is of gaiety and abundance, which is of course what you'd hope for in a home. The first fruits of the harvest would be dedicated to them, and it was by their graces that the fortunes of your household could make or break. We get an exceptional glimpse of how this really felt in action from another amazing survival from the ancient city, this time from ancient comedy, from the comic playwright Plautus. He was roughly a contemporary of Cato the Elder, who gave us the prayer we've just discussed, and his plays are some of the earliest Latin we have outside of inscriptions. So it's a real treat for us to hear his words echoing down to us across the millennia, and it's a particular treat for us right now as we think about the Lares, because he opens one of his most popular plays, known as The Pot of Gold, with a lar coming out of a house in the prologue, and this lar gets the audience up to speed with the plot by explaining what's going on. He's the lar familiaris, the household deity of an old man called Euclio. And rather than have me summarize the plot to you, let this lar from the 2nd century BCE speak to you directly in his own words. The actual plot of the comedy doesn't particularly matter here because we won't get into it. And honestly, Roman comedy is often obnoxious to modern sensibilities, and the plight of the daughter, who you'll hear mentioned, is actually appalling, and I cut off before we get to it as it's not relevant to us anyway. But all that aside, just listen to how the lar speaks about how it behaves and how it is treated, or how it thinks it should be treated, and what role it plays in the fortunes of the house. Quite wonderfully, he starts out by explaining exactly who he is. In case anyone wonders who I am, I'll tell you briefly. I'm the guardian spirit of this household, which you saw me coming out from. For many years already I've been occupying this house and protecting it for the father and grandfather of the man who lives here now. Now this man's grandfather entrusted me on bended knee and behind everyone's back with a treasure of gold. He buried it in the middle of the hearth, entreating me to guard it for him, and when he died he didn't even want to make this known to his own son. He was so greedy. He wished to leave him penniless rather than show this treasure to his son. He did leave him a piece of land, not a big one though, so that he could live on it with great toil and miserably. When the man who'd entrusted the gold to me died, I began to observe whether his son would in any way hold me in greater honour than his father had. He took less and less trouble over me and showed me less respect, and I returned the favour. He also died poor. He left a son behind, the one who lives here now, a man of the same character as his father and grandfather. He has one daughter. She worships me every day with incense or wine or something else and gives me garlands, and it's in order to honour her that I let this man here, Euclio, find the treasure, so that he might give her more easily in marriage, should he wish to do so. So, the protagonist of the play, the old man Euclio, only discovers the pot of gold because this lar wants him to find it. And he wants him to not for his own sake, but for his daughter's. As you heard, the lar tells us that Euclio's been neglectful of the household deities, just like his forebears, who, as a result, all lived miserable and impoverished lives, even though there was a pot of gold in the very floor beneath their feet. The daughter, on the other hand, has been pious and generous and attentive to the Lares, and for this she's rewarded by them. The gold is discovered for her sake, although the entire plot of the comedy has to unravel before she gets it. We find out how the Lars should be treated, worshipped every single day, as the lar says, with incense or wine or something else, and given garlands. And we also find out the full extent to which the fortunes of the family are dictated according to how well the Lares are disposed towards them, which is directly proportional, of course, to how well they have been treated. We also find out that this is intergenerational. The Lares follow and remember the family history, and this is known to them better than it is even to family members. So the La in the play embodies the role as envisioned, guardian of the home, tied to the place, morally attentive, active in the fortunes of the household, and part of an inherited continuity across generations. Imagine how living with such gods would be. Gods that nobody else worshipped and who were concerned about no other worshippers, and they knew all the secrets of the house. Imagine how present and how integral to your comings and goings they would feel, all the more so because part of the particularities of each household set of lares were the ancestral spirits of the family. Romans worshipped the spirits of the departed as the manes, who were shades of sorts. These were not gods, but numinous entities. Each family had their own ancestor cult, and part of that was wrapped up in the worship of the lares. The familial gods were mixed up with the shades of the ancestors, and offerings at the lararium covered all these bases. Other deities important to the house could also be added to these shrines. So just as every household had its own particular history, each lararium had its own particular character and conflation of things. If we look at the iconography again, you'll see that in the standard layout, 2 lares flank a central figure, and this is usually thought to be the genius of the male head of the household, the pater familias. And usually there are serpents who are thought to be the genii loci, the spirits of the place that we mentioned earlier. And just in case you're wondering about the word genius, although it looks like the English word genius, it derives from the Latin gens, meaning roughly family or clan, which itself derives from the verb gignere, meaning to beget or to bring forth. So the genius, plural genii, are the divine essences begotten from the people and the place. English genius also derives from this because we take it to mean the talent native to you at birth, something inherent in you and belonging to you alone. It came to be that every individual had their own genius, which was something like your higher divine self. The poet Horace describes it as the reason for people's differing personalities. Why one man prefers playing, idling, oiling himself to Herod's fine palm groves, while his rich brother works without cease from dawn to evening shadow to tame his woodland tract with fire and metal. The genius only knows, companion controlling our natal stars, God of our human nature, mortal with each life, though fickle in aspect, bright or dark. So here we see the genius accompanying individual lives and affecting the very disposition of a person. That the head of the household had his own particular guardian spirit isn't therefore particularly surprising. And if you're interested in the imperial cult, look out for that one because it's commandeered in innovative ways by Rome's emperors. We'll come back to it in a future episode when we look at the gods of the crossroads. But on the lararium, this central figure is depicted conducting the rituals that would assure the well-being of the household. And the snakes are so interesting because if they are the genii loci, the spirits of the place, then here again is something far removed from Greek anthropomorphism, gods and human forms. And here again we sense the Roman religious imagination perceiving the divine in other forms than perfect human bodies. Serpents symbolize fertility and longevity, but they're also dangerous, of course, and so they can be protective, but they need to be treated with caution. In that context, the imagery makes a lot of sense. Snakes were also regarded as chthonic creatures, which connects them to the underworld and therefore to the ancestor cult tended at the altars. And I wonder also about the snake's belly and whether its extended in constant contact with the ground doesn't also make its form particularly suited to a spirit of the place being, as it is, so grounded and stuck to the very surfaces of places. Coming out of the holes in the ground where they nest, they do seem to be begotten by the very earth and bring with them into the upper world something hissing from the underworld. And the Lares, although jolly and dancing and drinking, did nevertheless carry a lot of underworld connotations. They weren't celestial deities, but were rather very rooted in the earth and the infernal world belief. And there was even some mythology about the Lares explaining how they came to be. And this isn't the jolliest of myths, but it does give us glimpses of yet more forgotten deities. So here we go. The mother of the Lares, as Ovid tells it, was Lara. She's otherwise known as Mater Larum, Larunda, or even Mania. And she was the daughter of the river god Almo. That's a river just south of Rome. It once flowed into the Tiber. Larunda was a nymph, and she was extremely talkative. Ovid says her name was originally Lala, in reference to her loose tongue, la-la-lying all the time. And she happened to know about Jupiter's adulterous affair with Juturna, a Roman goddess of fountains. And so Larunda, Lala, brimming with this information, couldn't bite her tongue. In the end, she goes to Jupiter's wife Juno and tells her all about it. And you'd think that over time these deities might learn that this is never going to end well for them. And certainly it spelled doom for Larunda, because when Jupiter found out about her gossipy blabbering, he wrenched out her tongue as punishment. But silencing her physically was not enough for him. He was no doubt in a lot of trouble with Juno, so he ordered Mercury to take her off to the underworld. En route, however, Mercury took a fancy to the now mute nymph, and so, to add insult to injury, he had his way with her, and the result was the birth of the Lares. Now, I don't think we ought to imagine that this poor nymph gave birth to all the Lares everywhere for all time. Rather, I think she gave birth to the archetypal pair, such as are represented on the household shrines. So part of the significance of this origin story, apart from explaining their underworld connection, is connecting them to a tongue that had been silenced, a divinity that could not speak. It taps into Roman concerns about binding hostile tongues, and there were various rites and ceremonials for that. And what it concerns in terms of the home and for the Lares is that they learned their lesson from the blabbering mother and would hold their own tongues and keep the family secrets. The early Christian theologian Tertullian, who was himself an inhabitant of Roman North Africa and well acquainted with Roman religion, liked to mock it by making it sound as ridiculous as possible, and at one point he mocks the Lares, trying to show that they were hardly so very well regarded really, because if the figurines got too old or if they broke, he says the family would melt down the bronze and turn them into pots and pans. We always need to be aware that this is polemic specifically geared towards making traditional Roman religion sound as stupid as possible, but it is a funny glimpse of how you might be pragmatic, if needs be, with statues of your family gods. But in reality, Tertullian knew just how pervasive and penetrating this particular facet of Roman religion was, which was all the more reason to try to reduce it to pots and pans. And there's evidence, in fact, that long after Christianity had overtaken the empire and after the old gods had all been banned, the Lares still lingered in some homes, more tenacious, it seems, in the end than the Olympians themselves. I think that this is really testament to the power of these gods over the individual imagination and testament to the strength of the personal attachment to them. So while we have a pantheon with gods great and small all over the place, with some conspicuous and splendid public temples, what the Lares show us is a far more personal, intimate and private relationship with gods that differed from house to house, and every household had them. They weren't universal in identity, but universal and ubiquitous in presence, and they were personally invested in you from birth to death, as Horace said, your companion controlling your natal stars. They embodied the bittersweet joys of life, as Horace seems to acknowledge when he says people propitiated the genius, who knows life's brevity with flowers and wine. And I love the idea of throwing flowers and wine at the spirit of life's brevity. And so we'll pick up next time by looking around the Roman home some more to see what other gods resided there. But for now, to end, I'll leave you with another prayer to the Lares, which we have preserved for us, embedded in another poem by Tibullus this time, here wishing for the simplicity of earlier times and to escape the endless horrors of war and conflict, a haunting sentiment that resonates well enough through the ages. Lares, gods of my fathers, preserve me. While young and still nursing, you guided me when I played at your feet. Let none profane your antique images. Rough-hewn wooden statues set upon altars of upturned sod then dwelled among our grandfathers. In those days, humble reverence provided you with sweet honey alone. You stayed in the meagre shrines made of twigs. In tattered robes the gods were pleased with offerings of grapes and wreaths of wheat set upon carved heads. Granted his wish, a man would bring you honey cakes and set his virgin daughters to attend your little shrines. Lares, turn away from us those who scheme against us with their bronze weapons.